He was fighting in the UFC while he was a full-on criminal. I think they stole like $80 million, something crazy like that. He was a part of the biggest bank robbery in like the history of Great Britain.
From the UFC octagon to the London underworld, Lee Murray dominated every place he stepped in. Winning a fight against Andreson Silva, getting into street brawls, and living a life of crime since early childhood, Murray was so feared that even the London police were asked to avoid him. Until one day, when he decided to steal over £50 million from a local cash depot. This is the bone-chilling story of a gangster and a fighter who lost his UFC career and became the mastermind behind the biggest cash heist in world history. Born in 1977 in southeast London, Murray was always a troublesome child. During his primary school years, he hung out with a group of kids who called themselves the Buttmarsh Boys. Every other day, they'd get into fights with other kids from different areas, and Lee would make sure to be a part of these brawls. In their heads, they were protecting the Buttmarsh estate, the place they all called home. But in reality, they were just little kids trying to find an adrenaline rush any chance they got. However, Murray was different. His childhood was troubled because of his violent relationship with his father, and these brawls were his way to take out all the anger he had bottled up inside. Murray's mother met Brahim Lamrani, the father of Lee, in Gran Canaria, Spain, and since Lamrani used to work in Morocco, he was almost never home. For the first 7 years after Lee's birth, he was raised alone by his mother. When his father came back, he developed a drinking problem, and because of that, Lee was often abused, scolded, and hurt by him. This abuse got to the point where the police became involved and warned Lamrani to control himself and his anger. Yet his alcoholic and domineering father never listened. One day, Lee was getting scolded by his father, and instantly his dad lost it. He went on to hit him, and for the first time, after years of tolerating everything, Lee lost it. According to their then next-door neighbor, Lee was just a little kid, and he turned around to hit his father and knocked him out clean. He was so fed up with being treated poorly and the constant abuse that he didn't care about the father-son relationship. He just wanted the abuse to stop, and fighting back was the only option that made sense to his developing brain at the time. This was a massive moment in his life, and many say that it shaped Lee Murray into the person, the fighter, and the thug he had become later. Soon afterward, Lee joined the Eaglesfield Boys' School, where he met Paul Allen, a friend who later became a significant part of his life of crime. Murray and Allen both were average students, but did really well in other activities like sports. They were also involved in different illegal activities together, mostly focusing on earning money from drug dealing on the streets. For them, this was an easy way to get some cash in their pockets. Murray was powerful and had no control over his anger. Allen shared these traits with him, and together, they joined a street gang on the Barnesfield estate. Murray started living on the streets because he was expelled from schools constantly, and he didn't want to work any job. For him, the streets were his home, drug dealing was his job, and fighting people for no reason was his entertainment. He started living the life of a typical homeless drug dealer, and eventually got used to this routine. According to some, the gang he became a part of worked directly with a Nigerian group of drug dealers who controlled the Plumstead train station. This was their territory, and all the drug deals they did were here. However, one day, a gang war broke out where Murray, Allen, and the rest of the gang fought another group, winning another local territory. They started to expand their drug operation in other parts of the area. Unfortunately, this was the first of a long list of mistakes that Murray made. Shortly afterward, he was arrested by the police and convicted of possession of cocaine and cannabis. The court named him a notorious drug dealer and said that Paul Allen and everyone else in the gang were Lee Murray's drug runners. He was later sentenced to a term at a young offenders institution in London. Many believed that Murray was simply a bully who started running with the worst of the worst and lost his way. However, In his eyes, he wasn't a bully. He was simply a man who liked to control everything and fought off anyone who messed with his business. After his term at the Young Offenders Institute in Feltham came to an end, Murray started going to the gym. This was his way of coping with everything that he had been through and taking out his anger. He only became more aggressive with time, and to show his support, Alan also joined the gym. The two friends were back together, but this time they weren't dealing drugs. They were training to become better men, professional, respectable men. But obviously, they weren't used to being disciplined and straightforward. They looked for shortcuts in everything and, well, making money easily. So, to build their bodies, they started using steroids. The drug money they had was spent on these drugs, fast cars, fashionable clothing, and everything materialistic that they could get their hands on. The police often stopped them for different minor offenses, but they never gathered enough evidence to arrest Murray or Alan. In 1998, Murray and his then-girlfriend Siobhan Rowlings became parents to Lily Jane, his first daughter. People thought that since he was a father now, he would change his ways. However, this wasn't true at all. Despite going to the gym, Murray was pushed back into the drug-dealing game. He got into another turf war with a rival gang just a few weeks after the birth of his daughter. This brawl led to the arrests of a lot of his friends, but somehow, Murray slipped away. This was the moment when he realized that drug dealing meant easy money, but came with a lot of risk, especially since he had a daughter to look after. He was also planning on marrying his girlfriend, which meant that he needed a career, not just being a drug dealer on the streets. As fate would have it, the opportunity automatically landed in his lap. Just a few weeks after he escaped the police during the gang war, he was introduced to the world of mixed martial arts, which allowed him to train with professionals, take out his anger in the gym, and eventually become a professional fighter. For Murray, this was it. He was already super strong and was constantly getting into random fights. If he could become a professional MMA athlete, his life would change and he would have a respectable career. Plus, he would be doing what he was already good at, so becoming an MMA fighter was more like his calling. He started training rigorously at the gym, understanding everything about the sport, and building himself to become a professional fighter. In 1999, he participated in his first ever proper event, the Millennium Brawl. This was his moment to prove that he wasn't just a bad student and a drug dealer. In fact, he was an extremely talented fighter who could take the street fights into the ring and win. In his first ever fight, he was put up against Rob Hudson, another extreme fighter who was known to finish off his opponents brutally. Surprisingly, Murray wasn't afraid even one bit, despite being an amateur. When the fight started, he knocked down Hudson in the very first round. The entire crowd at the Hemel Hempstead Pavilion went crazy for him. He moved extremely quickly, and his attacks were surprisingly good, especially for a beginner. Andy Jardine, an event promoter, even said that everyone called him Lightning Lee Murray because of his insane speed in the ring. From this point onward, Murray decided that professional fighting was his career. He was extremely good at it, and because of this amazing debut fight, he easily entered more tournaments, earning a good amount of money. A few years later, he even secured a contract with the Ultimate Fighting Championship, which was a big move up for him. In his debut fight, he took down Jorge Rivera in the very first round, almost recreating the scene of his first fight back in 1999. Unfortunately, Lee Murray couldn't continue fighting in the UFC for long. He was a criminal back in the UK and had open cases related to assault against him. This made it impossible for him to get US visas, and therefore he couldn't fight. In September 2004, he fought Andreson Silva in a cage rage fight for the middleweight title, which he lost by a unanimous decision. He started to lose his groove after this, and went on to get involved in numerous street brawls for petty reasons. Soon afterward, one of these brawls became the reason for his career coming to an end. On the 28th of September 2005, Lee Murray attended the birthday party of Lauren Pope, a British model, and he got into a fight with some people. According to some reports, Lee was trying to save his friend from being stabbed by some people, and when he jumped in, he became the target. Murray was stabbed in the lung, which severed his artery and punctured his lung. He was immediately taken to the hospital, where the doctor performed life-saving surgery on him. Thankfully, he was saved. However, his UFC, MMA, and professional fighting career had come to an end forever. Murray knew that he could never get in the ring again. His injuries just wouldn't allow him to fight, and slowly he started to fall back to his old ways. This was the biggest mistake he made in his life, because the next few decisions he was going to take were going to end his life as a free man. Just a couple of months before the stabbing incident, Lee Murray was stopped by the Kent police near the Securitas depot in Tunbridge, England. They suspected that Lee was studying the depot with two unidentified men, as if they were planning something. However, since they didn't have any proof, Lee and his friends were left alone. But the police were actually right. Lee was planning something big, and the Securitas depot was his target. The Securitas depot held new currency and stored all old currency printed by the Bank of England before they were distributed or destroyed. 5 companies, including Securitas, had different depots all across the UK, and they held millions of pounds at a time. For Lee, robberies weren't anything new. He had been doing it since before he became a teenager. And now that his fighting career was over, he was getting back in the game. According to police reports, Lee and a group of other criminals, including his childhood friend Paul Allen, studied the Tunbridge depot for quite some time. It was a highly guarded place, and getting near it was an impossible task, let alone robbing it. Yet, this gang was determined, and their eyes were set on the prize, which was going to be in millions. The most important part of their plan was to study the routine of Colin Dixon, the manager of the depot. Colin was a highly trained officer who never kept the same routine. He regularly took different routes to the depot, changed cars, and was specifically asked to write the nature of his job on a piece of paper in case any officers stopped and questioned him. For years, he had been following this routine, and no colleague or depot worker knew where he lived. But since Lee Murray, Paul Allen, and the rest of the group had been following him for months, they knew exactly where he lived in Herne Bay. Once they knew everything about his routine, they decided to go on with the plan. They were about to commit one of the biggest robberies in the history of the UK, and perhaps the most well-planned organized crime of all time. On the 21st of February 2006, 2 of the gang members wearing police uniforms stopped Dixon just outside the Stockbury village. They asked him to turn off his car, come out and sit in the unmarked police cruiser. The police car was actually a Volvo S60 being driven by the robbers, and all they wanted was for Dixon to leave his vehicle. That day, for the first time ever, Dixon broke protocol, and instead of following the officers to the police station, he got out of the car. When he sat in the Volvo, the robbers put him at gunpoint and drove to Mereworth. At this point, Dixon realized that he was getting kidnapped. Little did he know, he was just a small part of a much bigger plan. He was then transferred to a white van and driven to a farm near Staplehurst. The 2 men impersonating police officers then drove to Dixon's house and picked up his wife and son, telling them a fake story about Dixon being hurt in a car accident. They were also taken to the farm and tied up. Now, the robbers had leverage. If Dixon didn't comply with their requests, they threatened to hurt his family. Stuck in a hard place, Dixon realized that the only option he had was to tell the robbers everything he knew and give them whatever they wanted. However, as soon as he heard the robbers interrogate him about the depot, he realized that something big and bad was about to happen. At that time, the depot had nearly £200 million stored inside in new and old currency. If the robbers made their way in there, an enormous amount of the Bank of England's money would be gone. For quite some time, Colin thought about lying, misleading the robbers, and trying to save his family, but nothing worked. Lee Murray's gang was determined to rob the depot, so they picked up Colin and took him to the depot. If he was there, entering the area would be easy, and they could get on with the robbery quickly. At 1 a.m. on the 22nd of February 2006, 3 vehicles, including the Volvo S60, a Vauxhall Vectra, and a 7.5-ton Renault Midland truck, drove to the depot. Then, Dixon and one of the impersonating police officers got out and rang the main doorbell. The operator opened the door after looking at Colin Dixon, wondering why the manager was visiting so late at night. He had no idea why Dixon was with a police officer, but he simply assumed that something might need to be checked out out at the depot. As soon as he opened the door, the robber subdued the operator. Dixon quickly opened the yard gate so the vehicles could enter. Reality slowly started to settle in. The Securitas depot was about to get robbed, and millions of pounds were about to vanish into thin air. Dixon or anybody else in the depot could do absolutely nothing because the robbers were armed with AK-47s, shotguns, pistols, and even submachine guns. If they even moved or questioned anything, it was going to be suicide. Because of this, Colin decided to help the robbers in any way possible, only so the robbery could come to an end as soon as possible. The gang had 7 members, and each of them carried the massive metal cages full of cash to the truck. They wanted to load the truck's container with the cages so they wouldn't have to pick up the cash by hand. However, the cages were so heavy with all the cash that they couldn't load it in the truck. They were also extremely short on time because at any moment, any one of the 14 employees in the depot could trip the alarm and call the police. Therefore, time was of the essence. One of the robbers hopped on a power lifter and tried to operate it, hoping that he would carry all the cash and load it in the truck. But since he had no idea how to use it, he kept crashing. Then a Securitas worker was asked at gunpoint to drive and load the money. He kept crashing the machine and finally wedged it between the tail lift of the truck, rendering it useless. Dixon also tried to move the pallet mover in a way that would disrupt the robbery, but he was seen by one of the robbers. Time was running by, and they had hardly any money in the truck. So the robbers decided that the only way they were making it out of the depot on time was if they loaded the truck by hand. They grabbed bundles of notes and shoved them in shopping trolleys. Each trolley was then rolled onto the truck, and after nearly 90 minutes, they decided to leave. At 2:44 a.m., all 7 members hopped in their own cars and drove their separate ways. They had managed to load 17 cages and 3 trolleys full of cash in the truck. Nobody knew what the score was, but looking at the piles of cash, it was not just a few million, but well over 50 million pounds. At 3:15 a.m., 30 minutes after the robbers left, Dixon tripped the alarm and called the police. That is when they realized that 53 million pounds was gone, making it the biggest robbery in the history of the country. The police were left in shock just thinking about the amount. The most shocking part was that there was still 154 million pounds left in the depot, and if the robbers had had more time or space, they probably would have cleaned that out too. The very next day, police investigations began immediately. A £2 million reward was offered by Securitas and the insurance companies to anyone who had information about the heist. This reward was also the largest reward ever offered in the UK. The police knew that making arrests was extremely important. It was a massive robbery, and this was their chance to show their competency. So on the evening of the 23rd of February, police officers arrested 2 people. A 29-year-old man and a 31-year-old woman in South London. The same day, a 41-year-old woman was also arrested at the Portman Building Society in Bromley. Officers also found the cars, including the Volvo, Vectra, and Dixon's Nissan, in different areas across London. All of this evidence was piling up, but nobody had any idea where the money was. Various arrests were made, and a few £100,000 were also recovered, which was believed to be money related to the robbery. But this was a very small amount. The masterminds behind the plan needed to be identified and arrested, and the police had no idea where to look. 4 days after the robbery, Murray and Allen quickly fled the country and went to Amsterdam. They knew that if they stayed in the UK, it would just be a matter of time before the police caught up to them. From Amsterdam, they went to Morocco to spend all the money they had stolen. The rest of the gang members, including individuals known as Bukpapa, Russia, Royal, and others, were arrested in the UK and tried in the criminal court. But still, Murray and Allen were on the run. The investigations kept going on, and at one point, the officers considered the possibility that since this robbery was impossible without an inside man, and Colin Dixon's activities that day were out of routine, maybe he was a member of the gang. The main issue was that despite being given explicit instructions to not leave his car, Dixon simply went on to sit in the police cruiser. He also didn't trip the alarm instantly, but waited 30 minutes, saying that he was making sure the robbers had left. Looking at all of this, it seemed likely that he was the inside man. But there was a huge twist. More investigation revealed that Dixon actually had no idea about the robbery. In fact, Emir Heisenaj, a member of the robbery gang, was the inside man. Emir was also an employee at the depot who recorded the entire security layout and took pictures for the gang to help carry out the robbery. Dixon was cleared, but the biggest issue remained. The money was nowhere to be found. On the 25th of June, 2006, 4 months after the robbery, the Moroccan police and the UK authorities worked together to locate Lee Murray. He was found at a shopping centre in Rabat, Morocco, and was immediately arrested. Kent police issued a statement claiming that they had been looking for Murray for 3 months and they will be seeking his extradition to the UK. He was one of the prime suspects of the robbery, and without him being investigated and tried, the case would never be closed. Unfortunately, the UK and Morocco had no extradition treaty, and therefore the process was going to be extremely lengthy and hectic. By this point, over 30 people had been arrested in the UK in relation to the Securitas depot robbery, and Murray was one of the suspects. However, since he was in Moroccan jail, nothing could be done. 3 years had passed by, and by now, it was also confirmed that Lee Murray had been given Moroccan citizenship. Using this, he won the argument against his extradition to the UK. The case was falling apart because the Kent police knew Murray was a big part, or possibly the leader, of the robbery gang. But there was no way to bring him back to the country. He was being kept in a prison in Salah, and the Moroccan courts said that he would stand trial for the robbery in Morocco. Knowing that he would be convicted, he tried to escape prison in 2009 through a small window inside his cell. His plan was to use small blades to cut the iron bars on the window and slide through it. Unfortunately, while he was in a different cell serving his punishment for being caught with contraband, another inmate entered his cell and was caught. This disrupted Murray's entire breakout plan, and he had to stand trial for the Securitas depot robbery. In 2010, he was finally convicted of the robbery and sentenced to an additional 10 years in prison. Lee Murray knew that his life was going to be spent in jail, and as a last resort, he decided to appeal the sentence. Little did he know, this appeal would only land him in even more trouble than he was already in. When the appeal was argued, the Moroccan court decided that a 10-year sentence was actually short for his crime. They then raised it to 25 years, and Lee Murray was sent back to prison. Today, he is serving his 25-year life sentence in a prison in Tifel, northwestern Morocco. In 2023, he was interviewed for the documentary Catching Lightning, in which he said that if he could go back in time, he wouldn't change anything. He had no regrets for anything he did. He also expressed that when he gets out, he will go back to fighting and win a UFC title. In his words, "My story isn't finished. This isn't the end." The Securitas depot heist was one of the biggest robberies in UK history, but there was one robbery even crazier, where 4 thieves stole over $100 million in just 27 seconds. So, if you want to see how that went down, check out this video next.